Imagine you are driving down the highway at 100 kilometers per hour. You check your rearview mirror, humming along to the song on the radio. Everything is fine. It's a beautiful day until your car hits a small pothole. With that jolt, the heavy keychain dangling from your ignition is pulled slightly downward. Because the torque of the spring inside the ignition switch is so weak and the design so flawed, the key inadvertently rotates from the run position to the accessory or off position. That second is the quietest and most terrifying second of your life. The engine cuts out, the power steering becomes heavy and locks up. The brake assist is disabled, and deadliest of all, the electrical connection to the airbags, which are supposed to save your life in the event of a crash, is completely severed. Do you know how much it would have cost to fix this deadly mechanism, to replace that weak spring with a new one? Just 57 cents per vehicle. The world's largest automaker sacrificed the lives of 124 people for the sake of a 57-cent cost saving, and at the end of the day, was forced to face a bill of $5.3 billion. I am Halil Ibrahim, a mechanical engineer and an executive in the automotive industry. Today, we will deeply examine General Motors, the lead actor in this $5.3 billion fiasco. We engineers use a system called FMEA, or Failure Mode and Effects Analysis, to prevent the kind of deadly design flaws I just mentioned. If an honest FMEA had been conducted for this ignition switch that day, the severity of the error would have received the highest score because it directly meant death. The risk priority number, RPN, would have hit the faces of all the engineers at the table like a red alarm, and the resolution of the issue would have been inevitably demanded. But on that day, global automotive management system rules were not being applied at that table. The blood-curdling part is this. Engineers had already noticed this error between 2001 and 2004. However, they did not report it because stopping the production line would be costly and time-consuming. When 2006 arrived, they secretly changed the part, but kept the part number the same, attempting to hide the trail of this defect from regulators and the public, just like a criminal throwing the murder weapon into the river. Now, please grab your tea or coffee and sit back, because today, we are not just going to talk about a company's bankruptcy or a tabloid scandal. We are opening our crime scene investigation kit. We will lay out the anatomy of an industrial giant that held the title of the world's largest automobile manufacturer for 77 years, personally wrote the rules of modern capitalism, and changed the fate of World War II. We will examine, step by step through the eyes of an engineer, how a company was born, how that flawless system at the peak became sluggish, and ultimately, how its own success poisoned it. Welcome to the life cycle of an empire. However, to understand how a company fell into enough hubris to sweep a 57-cent death trap under the rug, looking at the 2000s is not enough. To find the root cause of the disease, we must go back to the very beginning. To those chaotic days when the automobile was seen merely as a noisy, smelly, and dangerous toy, and hundreds of small manufacturers were eating each other alive. To the time when America's roads were not yet paved. To that first spark where a man came out and declared war on Henry Ford. To understand our story, and in fact, the roots of modern industry, we must return to the early 1900s, the Wild West of the automotive world. In those years, the market was extremely chaotic. Hundreds of small manufacturers would often go bankrupt before they could even deliver the vehicle after taking the customer's money. To end this chaos, Henry Ford established one of the most famous strategies in engineering history, the Model T. One color, black, one chassis, one vehicle type. Ford's system was flawless in terms of quality standardization and operational efficiency. However, in terms of marketing, it was incredibly rigid. People were forced to buy the vehicle that was good for Ford's operational efficiency, not the vehicle they wanted. At this very point, William Crapo Durant, who came from carriage manufacturing and initially turned his nose up at automobiles, calling them noisy and dangerous, took the stage. Durant came up with a massive market segmentation idea against Ford's single-type vision. His philosophy was a car for every purse and purpose. On September 16, 1908, he founded General Motors as a holding company. To implement his strategy, Durant, like an insatiable hunter, quickly bought independent brands like Buick, Oldsmobile, Cadillac, and Oakland, gathering them under a single roof. But we engineers know very well. Vision gets you on the road, but what keeps you on the road is the system you establish. Durant was an incredible sales genius, but he was a total disaster when it came to business management and process optimization. This debt-fueled aggressive growth created massive chaos within the company. Different brands were competing with each other in the same factories, the supply chain was entangled, and financial resources were bleeding. The result? In 1910, the company was crushed under a massive debt exceeding $1 million, and Durant was kicked out of the company he founded by the banks. Growing a company might be the job of an entrepreneur, but keeping a massive structure alive is entirely an engineering problem. Enter Alfred Pritchard Sloan Jr. Sloan was an analytical engineer coming from a bearing company who solved everything with data, organizational charts, and process optimization. He took the chaotic structure inside GM and established that magnificent system taught in the best business schools even today: decentralized operations under centralized policy and financial control. Think of this system like a massive V8 engine. Chevrolet, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, Buick, and Cadillac, each of these was a cylinder working on its own, making its own designs. But they were all connected to that single main crankshaft which headquarters called financial control. Sloan designed not just the factory, but also the psychology of the American people. Instead of putting his competitors into a destructive price war, he constructed a flawless product architecture called the Ladder of Success. A young and low-income American would buy their first vehicle from the entry-level Chevrolet. As their income increased, they would be promoted to Pontiac and Oldsmobile, and when they reached the peak of their career, they would buy Cadillac, the ultimate symbol of the American dream. The customer was kept inside this ecosystem for a lifetime. This was a perfect consumption ecosystem offered to the public at that time. So, how would that low-income customer buy their first Chevrolet? Sloan had a solution system developed for this as well. In 1919, he established the General Motors Acceptance Corporation, GMAC, inventing the modern vehicle loan system. You no longer needed cash in your pocket to buy a car. Imagine the situation here. GM was proceeding almost like a trendsetter in that era, bringing many unprecedented situations to life. Sloan's inventions didn't stop there. To feed the massive capacity of the factories, he needed to sell people something new constantly. With the design department he established under the leadership of Harley Earl, he transformed the automobile from a mechanical tool into a fashion icon. Even if the motor remained the same, he changed the exterior case of the car every year. The concept of planned obsolescence and annual model change that we see in mobile phones today was born in those years in this way. The system worked so well that GM crushed Ford in 1929 and became the market leader. When World War II broke out, this massive production line switched from civilian vehicles to military hardware production with rare agility. It single-handedly undertook almost half of the war contracts given to the entire American automotive industry. By producing legendary M18 Hellcat tank destroyers and Red Ball express trucks, it rightfully earned a title in the eyes of the public for that day: the Arsenal of Democracy. By the 1950s, General Motors was producing 1 out of every 2 vehicles sold in America. The famous quote by GM President Charles E. Wilson at the time was the most dramatic summary of that immense power the company had reached. "I thought what was good for our country was good for General Motors, and vice versa." This was an approach where no sector leader had ever been able to express themselves so openly with this perspective before, and it hasn't happened since. The system was flawless. From the outside, this massive armored knight looked invincible. But there is a ruthless rule in quality management. If you sanctify the metrics that took you to the peak and forget reality, that success starts to poison you from the inside. Sloan's flawless financial machine was actually a ticking time bomb placed at the foundation of the operation, and the fuse had slowly started to burn. The moment we executives and engineers should fear the most in business life is when things are going most perfectly. Because a company's brightest period is usually when its greatest operational blindness begins. By the 1960s, General Motors was an invincible giant, producing 1 out of every 2 cars on American roads. However, this massive market dominance ironically became the biggest factor preparing its own end. That enormous central financial control system, which carried the company to the top and made it a trendsetter, had turned into a massive bureaucratic cage that paralyzed the company's reflexes over time. Innovative decisions were no longer made by engineers sweating in the field and workshops. They were made by financiers trapped in Excel spreadsheets, quarterly profit margins, and ROI, return on investment targets. Now let's stop here and diagnose where the system broke from the perspective of a quality and operations manager. Because the collapse began not with the strengthening of competitors, but with a fatal logic error in GM's own accounting rules. There was a very dangerous metric inside the flawless-looking financial system Sloan established. In accounting standards, inventory was treated like cash. Think about what this means for a production manager. If every product you produce appears as cash on the balance sheet, even if it isn't sold, you would want to keep your factory's capacity utilization rate at 100% at all costs. This accounting illusion birthed the most toxic production culture the automotive industry has ever seen. Do not stop the production line, no matter what. Is the car at the end of the line defective? Don't stop. Do the parts not fit? Don't stop. Continue production. Get the car off the line. You can apply repairs later. This logic was a critical error that killed operational efficiency at the root. In the old GM system, an assembly worker did not have the authority to solve an error instantly when they noticed it. Defective cars continued to be produced, stocked in massive parking lots for months, and these errors were tried to be fixed after assembly or in repair lines created later, at a much higher cost. This situation was the black hole we call cost of poor quality in quality management. The numbers looked great on paper. Factories were working at full capacity, but in reality, poor quality was spreading to the cells like a chronic disease in the field. With an approach contrary to everything we define under the concept of operational excellence today, expecting the company to remain healthy for very long was not reasonable anyway. We can liken this situation to a knight crushed under the weight of his own armor. Your armor is so thick, so large, that you feel like no blow can harm you. But because of that massive weight, you completely lose your flexibility, speed, and maneuverability. This complacency brought by being unrivaled in its own ecosystem killed the soul of the automobile by the 1970s. Did a company controlling 50% of the market need to innovate? According to GM executives, no. Instead of producing what the consumer wanted, they started producing what was most suitable for their own operational and financial efficiencies and imposing it on the public with incredible marketing power. Just like the trap Henry Ford fell into years ago and Durant destroyed, they were now falling into it themselves. But this was an approach you could only sustain in the early 1900s. The market was now at a very different point, and competitors had long adapted to this new reality. When that massive bureaucracy stopped hearing the voice of the market, it was inevitable that disasters would emerge, destroying not only financials, but also engineering ethics. Because if the quality culture has rotted somewhere, disaster is only a matter of time, and those disasters started coming one after another. When financiers start silencing engineers in a company's boardroom, quality ceases to be just a matter of time. It turns into a matter of life and death. In that dark period spanning from the 1960s to the 1980s, General Motors officially sacrificed quality control and the most basic engineering ethics for the sake of short-term profit goals. Let's open the files of this chain of errors, recorded in automotive history as engineering massacres, one by one. Our first file, the Chevrolet Corvair. When engineers received a great instruction to cut costs, they decided to use an independent swing-axle rear suspension at the rear of the vehicle. However, this cheap design had a deadly flaw. When the vehicle entered sharp turns, the rear wheels would succumb to the laws of physics and tuck under, causing the car to suddenly flip over. When consumer rights advocate Ralph Nader exposed this engineering disgrace in his book, GM's reaction was to hire private detectives to discredit Nader instead of accepting the error and fixing the vehicle. Think of it this way. Instead of listening to the customer's complaint, you declare war on the customer and try to hide the defect. While this might seem like a tactic that could work on paper, unfortunately, it turned into a terrible fiasco because it caused fatalities in the field. Our second major file, the Chevrolet Vega. When the 1973 oil crisis broke out, GM hastily wanted to produce a fuel-efficient vehicle. Production was rushed so much that an aluminum engine block was combined with an iron cylinder head in the vehicle. Anyone with high school-level physics knowledge can tell you this. Two different metals heat up at different rates and expand at different rates. Think of this like pouring boiling water into a glass cup and the cup cracking. Every time the engine heated up, the two metals pushed against each other, engine gaskets constantly blew, and thousands of engines became trash while they were brand new. But the real betrayal was hidden in our third file, the Oldsmobile 5.8 diesel. In my opinion, this is the most striking, most horrifying example of how basic engineering principles were disregarded for profit greed. A fuel-efficient diesel engine was wanted. Normally, what do? You design a high-pressure resistant diesel engine block from scratch, right? GM didn't do that. Instead of allocating an R&D budget, they took the existing gasoline 350 V8 engine and went down the path of converting it to diesel. Pay close attention to the technical betrayal here. A gasoline engine has a compression ratio of 8.5 to 1, and 10 head bolts per cylinder are sufficient to hold this pressure. However, a diesel engine needs a massive compression ratio of at least 22 to 1 to detonate the fuel. The weak bolts of the gasoline engine could not withstand the terrible pressure created by the diesel. The bolts stretched like rubber, gaskets blew, and those engines literally self-destructed on the road. This engineering laziness, done just to save on R&D, erased the American public's trust in passenger diesel vehicles for decades. Even today, the skepticism towards diesel passenger cars in America might still lie in this engineering betrayal experienced years ago. And finally, the Cadillac Cimarron. In the industry, we call this badge engineering. They removed the logos of an entry-level cheap Chevrolet model, applied minor makeup, and tried to sell it as a luxury Cadillac at an exorbitant price. As a journalist at the time said, this was an attempt to palm off a cheap car to a luxury car customer, and it deeply shook Cadillac's legendary luxury perception. While Cadillac was a giant, always shouldering the brand in the luxury segment, there were very few moves that could consciously damage the brand perception more. Quality, operational efficiencies, and brand perceptions were crawling on the floor. Market share was melting. By 1984, GM management made a radical decision to learn the secret of the legendary production system of the Japanese, who were the new rulers of the market. They established a joint venture factory named NUMMI with Toyota in California. Toyota took over the Fremont factory, which GM had previously closed due to labor issues, strikes, and low quality. Pay close attention here. The managers and engineers at the factory were from Toyota, but the operators working on the production line were the same old unionized GM workers who were called problematic and lazy. The result was a slap in the face for the arrogant managers in Detroit. Those same workers, under Toyota's management, immediately started producing flawlessly at world standards with near-zero defects. If we had put an Ishikawa, that is, a fishbone diagram, on the table that day, we would have clearly seen that the root cause of poor quality was not manpower, that is, human. The problem wasn't the worker, the problem was method and management. What was the secret? Remember that toxic rule we established in the old GM system? Do not stop the production line, no matter what. Toyota did the exact opposite. They empowered the workers and introduced the andon cord system. When any worker saw a tiny quality issue in production, they could pull this cord to stop the entire factory, and the problem was solved at the source, without growing or being hidden. On one side, a lean production philosophy centering on process and people. On the other side, a massive bureaucracy seeing only the number of vehicles produced as an accounting metric. There was a new operational approach rising within the period, the Toyota Production System, TPS. This system, forming the foundations of lean manufacturing, was multiplying operational efficiency. So, do you think GM took this incredible lesson and applied it to all its factories? Of course not. According to GM's Hubris, they took lessons from no one. They only set trends, especially not from a Japanese competitor. Fearing the loss of their status quo and power, GM's top management strongly refused to integrate this new culture into other GM factories. Systemic hubris had completely blinded the company's corporate eyes, and GM tore up and threw away the greatest prescription for salvation in its hands. And as you will see in a moment, this corporate hubris would not be limited to production errors only. It would cause the company to press its own future in the desert with its own hands. If you are managing a technology or manufacturing company, there is a ruthless and unwritten rule of industrial survival. If a destructive technology, a disruptive innovation, is coming to your sector, you must sabotage your own existing product before your competitors do. You must destroy your own business with your own hands. Otherwise, someone from the outside comes and destroys you. General Motors signed its name to one of the biggest strategic suicides history has ever seen, precisely because it broke this rule. In the early 1990s, against the terrible air pollution in Los Angeles, the state of California initiated Zero-Emission Vehicle, ZEV, regulations. To comply with this, GM engineers actually proved what tremendous talent they possessed and launched the EV1, the industry's first modern commercial electric car, in 1996. The vehicle was literally a revolution. It wasn't one of those slow, clunky golf carts that came to people's minds when electric vehicle was mentioned until then. It was futuristic, incredibly aerodynamic, fast, and very quiet. Customers fell so in love with the vehicle that a waiting list of 4,000 people quickly formed. People had nicknamed driving this vehicle the Rocket Ride. GM had caught the future exactly 10 years in advance, but then cold winds began to blow in the boardrooms in Detroit. When finance and operations managers laid the future balance sheets of the EV1 project, that is, the business model, on the table, they faced a terrifying reality. Sit at that table with the eyes of an operations manager and look at the Excel spreadsheets. Does an electric vehicle have a carburetor? No. Transmission? No. Spark plugs, air filter, timing belt, engine oil change? None of them. In the automotive industry, the profit obtained from vehicle sales is only the tip of the iceberg. The real massive and endless revenue stream is aftermarket services, that is, spare parts and periodic maintenance. GM executives realized that electric vehicles would completely collapse this trillion-dollar spare parts ecosystem. This was the same betrayal as Kodak, who invented the digital camera, locking that technology in a safe so film sales wouldn't drop. Wanting to protect its existing business model and profitability, GM declared war on this revolution it produced itself. Although customers made repeated attempts to buy the EV1s, GM did not allow this. They only leased the vehicles to customers. Then, joining hands with the oil industry and spending millions of dollars, they lobbied the state to cancel those environmental regulations in California. They were successful too. Looking from the perspective of that day, although this seemed like a victory in quarterly balance sheets, today, when we look at the trillion-dollar position Tesla has reached, we can clearly see what a terrible strategic suicide this was in the long run. And by 2003, despite customers begging to buy the cars, even organizing fake funeral processions and protesting, all leased EV ones were forcibly recalled. Those wonderful engineering works were taken to the Arizona desert and pressed into scrap. Now, let's do an opportunity cost analysis, which we use a lot in quality management, and ask that famous question. If General Motors hadn't pressed those cars in the desert and had continued the EV1 program, what kind of company would it have turned into today? Pay close attention to the dates. The year GM crushed the EV1s is 2003. The year Martin Eberhard and Mark Tarpenning founded Tesla Motors in Silicon Valley, which Elon Musk would later grow, coincidentally, is also 2003. If GM hadn't thrown this project into the trash, it was exactly 10 years ahead of its competitors technologically. When we arrived in 2008, when that famous global crisis erupted and gasoline prices skyrocketed to $140 per barrel, GM would not have been a dinosaur in the swamp producing massive Jeeps. On the contrary, they would have had EV3 or EV4 generation vehicles, updated with lithium-ion batteries in their hands. Consumers going crazy over gasoline prices would have rushed to GM dealers in masses. General Motors would have woven that massive supercharger network that Tesla built today all over America in the early 2000s. The supply chain of battery technology would have remained in the hands of America and GM, not China. And today, GM would have been a trillion-dollar technology giant dominating software, battery, and autonomous driving. But what did they do? They preferred today's profit over tomorrow's leadership. They pressed innovation in the desert, and as that confused player scoring an own goal, they gifted the golden keys of the market to startups like Tesla. And as we will see in a moment, when the bill for this strategic blindness knocked on their doors in 2008, those massive profit castles they trusted so much would collapse on their heads like a sandcastle in just a few months. General Motors, pressing the future in the Arizona desert, had tied its profitability to a single strategy in the 2000s: massive SUVs and high fuel-consuming pickup trucks, like the Hummer series. The entire operational system established by the board of directors relied on only two flawed assumptions. Gasoline would always remain cheap, and consumer loans, GMAC, would always continue to flow like water. But things didn't work out that way. Generally, managers make their plans according to both the best case and the worst case scenarios, and take precautions for the threats in the bad scenario. GM, however, had put all its chips on the table without any plan B. And when 2008 came, that famous global financial crisis broke out. This crisis was a perfect storm that demolished the profitability castle GM had built from three sides. First, the price of a barrel of oil exceeded $140. Consumers fled from massive SUVs to small cars, but GM did not have these cars demanded by the market. Second, the crisis was a credit crisis. The car loans people used to buy vehicles and the financing dealers used to turn over stock were cut off like a knife. Third, consumer confidence had completely collapsed. The macroeconomic shocks were so devastating that the company's total global revenue melted by exactly $31 billion. That is, by 17.2% in just 1 year. GM shares, once $90, crashed below $5. The company was drifting uncontrollably towards bankruptcy. This collapse wave was so big that it was now impossible for the firm to solve this problem on its own. By November 2008, massive GM officially declared that it would run out of cash completely within months without state support. In December, GM CEO Rick Wagoner went to Washington, D.C. to request a bailout from the U.S. Senate with taxpayers' money. However, such a public relations fiasco, such corporate blindness occurred here that it is taught in business management classes even today. Company executives in a cash crisis, unable to pay suppliers, on the brink of bankruptcy, flew with luxury private jets instead of using commercial flights while going to ask the state, "Save us." This situation was the bitterest tableau of the disconnect between executives living in ivory towers and the reality of the street, and it created a huge outrage among the American people. When the President Obama administration took control of the situation, the first condition was this: CEO Rick Wagoner, who dragged the company into this collapse, must resign immediately. Wagoner resigned, but who paid the price? He left the company with a golden parachute compensation exceeding $10 million and a lifetime pension of $74,000 a year, while he retired with his millions. Below, in the factories, 22,500 blue-collar workers were losing their jobs. The ripple effect was so devastating that hundreds of thousands of people, along with the supply chain, were left under this wreckage. Finally, that inevitable day arrived. On June 1, 2009, General Motors declared $82.2 billion in assets and a massive $172.8 billion in debt, filing for the largest industrial bankruptcy in American history. They were making this application based on Chapter 11. So, was the state going to allow this massive organization with bankrupt systems to sink completely? Of course not. GM, as frequently said in America in those times, was too big to fail, and the state could not risk this chain collapse. That's why they made a very precise intervention. We can call this operational amputation in the industry. Using the Section 363 clause in bankruptcy law, a surgical operation was performed on the company with incredible speed, like 40 days. The government cut off all the gangrenous organization branches. The name of the existing company was changed to Motors Liquidation Company, that is, Old GM. Factories to be closed, legendary but loss-making brands like Pontiac, Saturn, Hummer, and Saab, toxic union debts, and lawsuits were imprisoned inside this trash company and left to die. Simultaneously, a completely debt-free new GM company was established. This new company continued on its way by purchasing only the profitable brands, Chevrolet, Cadillac, etc., and efficient factories in the hands of Old GM. This massive rescue operation cost the U.S. Treasury, and therefore the taxpayers, approximately $51 billion. The company had cleaned its balance sheet with state aid, leaving behind harmful brands and billions of dollars in debt. However, this bankruptcy protection law was valid only for assets within America. The company was in a deep cash flow crisis globally and in a position where it could not pay the debts of its overseas operations. Exactly during this liquidity crisis, GM executives signed such an agreement behind closed doors. What they sacrificed to save the day that day was actually the crown jewels of American engineering. And those jewels were on their way to China. Looking back from today, we clearly see. Saving the day that day did not prevent the company's real collapse. It only delayed it and opened the door to a much greater destruction. During the bankruptcy process in 2009, the U.S. government threw a $51 billion life preserver to GM. However, that rescue package had a ruthless rule. This taxpayers' money, by law, could only be used for assets within America. Yet the crisis was global. GM's passenger vehicle engineering base worldwide, GM Daewoo in Korea, was writing a terrible loss of $1.5 billion just due to fluctuations in exchange rates. GM management, struggling for cash and cornered, sought the remedy not in America, but in China. They secretly knocked on the door of SAIC, Shanghai Automotive Industry Corporation, a Chinese state-owned company with whom they had been running a 50-50 partnership since 1997. Chinese business philosophy is like chess. Your opponent looks like they are helping you when you are at your weakest, but they actually make you dependent on them. SAIC provided GM with a financial support of approximately $400 million, which was urgently needed at the time. But in return for this money, they extracted such a strategic concession from GM that this agreement would go down in automotive history as the Trojan Horse and was the beginning of the wave of collapse. SAIC bought only the 1% share of the joint venture, the golden share, for a laughable price like $85 million. With its share rising to 51%, the Chinese partner seized the legal control of the massive operation. Moreover, by establishing 51% dominance in a new company that would manage all sales in China, it recorded almost all of the profit on its own balance sheet. GM was slowly being ousted from the market it created itself. But the real betrayal happened in engineering, not in share ratios. Western firms have an unwritten rule when doing business in China. They never put their crown jewels, that is, their most up-to-date and critical technologies, into China. They always keep their partners one generation behind. However, in 2010, those GM executives who just wanted to cut costs a little more took an unimaginable step. They committed that all new internal combustion engines, hybrid systems, and electric vehicles would be developed jointly with SAIC in China. GM's best engineers were sent to Shanghai and taught their Chinese partners how to design vehicles and platforms from scratch. When I look at the financial output of this process with an executive's eye, my blood runs cold. Under normal circumstances, when SAIC used GM's global architectures produced with billions of dollars of R&D, such as Gamma 2 and Epsilon platforms, it had to pay a royalty to GM for each vehicle. However, when minor design changes were made to the vehicles and these vehicles were labeled as jointly developed new models, that massive royalty income for GM was instantly zeroed out. The master teaching everything to his student was being shot with his own weapon. Moreover, he was being trapped in a vicious cycle. GM, having all its technology sucked by its student, started to be defeated by the monster it created in global markets. SAIC created brands like MG with the technologies it learned from GM and started to seize the European, Australian, and Asian markets that GM abandoned because it couldn't compete one by one. the same bitter picture was happening in the Chinese market as well. GM's contraction in the Chinese market exceeded 30% in a short time. The bitterest, most ironic part happened in America's own backyard. American icon General Motors, instead of establishing factories in Latin America and selling vehicles it produced, started selling vehicles completely designed by SAIC in China and produced by Chinese engineers by pasting the Chevrolet logo on them. Today, 71% of Chevrolet vehicles sold in Mexico are completely Chinese-made. GM even imported the Buick Envision model produced in China to America, holding the title of America's largest Chinese automobile importer for a period. No engineering, no production. Only the badge of a 100-year-old legendary brand is being rented out. Today, there is very little time left until the expiration of that famous 30-year contract between SAIC and GM. The hourglass will run out in June 2027. For GM, whose share crashed to 6.9% in the Chinese market dominated by competitors like BYD, the real disaster will start that day. Why would SAIC, which has copied all of GM's technology, absorbed its engineering, and created its own global brands, renew this contract in 2027? If it doesn't renew, GM could be completely wiped out from the Chinese market and that production ecosystem, instantly waving the bankruptcy flag. If it does renew, GM risks turning into a hollowed-out marketing company that is no longer a car manufacturer, but merely rents out its logos to Chinese vehicles. American automotive leadership was transferred step by step behind closed doors like this, for the sake of those short-term quarterly profits and executive bonuses. But the game is not fully over yet. They needed to play one last gamble to survive. That massive gamble where they would decide to tear out their century-old internal combustion engine legacy. So, is the game over for General Motors, which lost its global markets to Chinese rivals and was shaken by massive quality fiascos? No. Before us stands a new GM that has decided to tear out its century-old internal combustion engine legacy to survive, playing a massive gamble. Today, the company under the management of CEO Mary Barra has finally accepted the changing nature of the market and committed to completely removing internal combustion engines from its product range by 2035 and selling only zero-emission vehicles. The technical backbone of this transformation is the flexible and scalable Ultium platform, where battery modules can be integrated directly into the vehicle chassis. However, the biggest irony of the automotive world lies right here. When we look at the company's 2024 financial statements with an executive's eye, we encounter an incredible reality. While the company's total revenues exceed $187 billion, that massive operating profit obtained does not come from successes in China or Europe. This profit comes entirely from gasoline-powered pickup trucks and massive SUVs with incredibly high profit margins and high fuel consumption sold in the North American market. In other words, yesterday's dirty technology is financing tomorrow's clean technology as today's cash cow. Still, there is a light at the end of the tunnel for engineering. In the last quarter of 2024, GM reached the point of variable profit positive in electric vehicles. That is, every electric vehicle produced has now started to cover its own cost. This was the most critical threshold for the firm in the transition from the cash-burning phase to sustainable production. Now let's get to the main point. What should we put in our pockets as an engineer, a quality manager, or an entrepreneur from this 100-year rise, hubris, and forced evolution story of an industry giant? Here are 4 golden rules that will go into textbooks. 1. Fixed cost trap and sluggishness. That central financial system Alfred Sloan established made the company the biggest in the world. However, this accounting hubris that ignored inventory costs caused them to push away Toyota's lean production philosophy with the back of their hand. Remember, economies of scale are not always good. If you lose agility, you will be crushed under your own massive mass in times of crisis. 2. Culture is more important than process. That ignition switch scandal, where 124 people died because of a 57-cent spring mechanism, proved that toxic corporate cultures are much harder to clean than balance sheets. If there is a hierarchical spiral of silence in your operations where bad news is swept under the rug, no quality management system you establish can save you. Transparency is a capital at least as valuable as cash flow. 3. Disrupt yourself, canceling the revolutionary EV1 project and pressing the cars in the desert just because it would spoil the existing profitable business model offered the market to Tesla on a gold platter. If there is a destructive innovation in your industry, you must sabotage your own existing product before your competitors do. 4. Never surrender the crown jewels. The concessions given to Chinese SAIC to solve the short-term liquidity crisis in 2008 were a strategic suicide. By handing over its own global platforms and engineering knowledge to the Chinese with its own hands, GM has come to the point of being wiped out from global markets today. Never, ever open your core competency to the outside for the sake of short-term cash. Time will tell if General Motors can put aside its century-old mechanical production hubris and survive in this new software-oriented war. However, this story painfully reminds us all how vital quality systems, ethical engineering, and long-term strategy are. What do you think about this series of strategic errors? If you were the operations manager sitting at the table in the 2008 crisis, would you have signed the China agreement to save the day that day, or would you have chosen a more bitter prescription? Let's discuss in the comments. I will read them all one by one. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for the continuation of such in-depth case analyses. I am Halil Ibrahim. Take care of yourselves and stay safe until we meet in the next industrial fire.